Looking back, it's hard to say exactly when I knew something was off with Avery. It wasn't like she suddenly turned into a completely different person overnight. No, it was more like tiny shifts here and there, cracks slowly forming in the facade of what I thought was our perfect life. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Everyone goes through phases, right? But things started piling up, little by little, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Avery used to be the last one to roll out of bed, usually half asleep until noon on the weekends. Now, she's up at dawn, slipping out from under the covers without a sound. I'd wake up to the sound of the bathroom door clicking shut and find her in front of the mirror, applying makeup like she was about to walk a runway. She never used to care about that stuff, at least not to this extent. And it wasn't just makeup. Suddenly, her closet started filling with designer clothes. She told me they were on clearance or from some sample sale. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her at first, but the way she carried herself, the way she smiled a little too smugly in those new outfits, it didn't sit right with me. Then there was the intimacy, or rather the lack of it. I remember coming home after a long day, hoping to hold her, to feel connected. She was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, and I came up behind her wrapping my arms around her waist. "Not now," she said, shrugging me off like I was a burden. That wasn't the only time either. It kept happening, excuses piling up. "I'm tired. It's been a long day. Maybe later." But later never came. I try not to let it bother me, but every time she pulled away, it felt like another punch to the gut. That's when the gifts started showing up. Strange little things that didn't seem to fit into our world. A bottle of expensive wine sat on the counter one evening. I figured she bought it for a special occasion, but she just shrugged when I asked. "Oh, it was from work? A little bonus." Then there were scented candles, lavender, which I knew she hated, and a sleek new bracelet with a small charm on it. I couldn't stop thinking about that bracelet. I'd seen something eerily similar on the wrist of Richard Carmichael's secretary at an office event. I didn't mention it at the time, but the thought burrowed deep in my mind, making it impossible to ignore. Evenings used to be sacred for us. We'd cook together, eat at the table, talk about our days. But now, Avery would either eat alone or order takeout. One night, she came home way past dinner. I was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for her, but she barely noticed. "Richard kept me late," she said, kicking off her heels without a second glance. Something about the way she said his name made my skin crawl. The phone was another red flag. She'd always been laid back with it, leaving it around the house without a care. But lately, it became like an extension of her hand. She wouldn't even leave it on the coffee table when she went to the bathroom. I caught a glimpse of her screen once, just long enough to see a string of heart emojis. But she locked it so fast, I almost questioned if I'd really seen it. When I asked her about it, she just laughed. "It's nothing. Just Laurel being silly." But the way she avoided my gaze made it clear it wasn't Laurel. I didn't know what to do with my suspicions at first. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, and the last thing I wanted was to start a fight over something that might just be in my head. So I went to Jonas, my best friend. We grabbed a few beers at our usual spot, and I laid it all out for him. "Man, I think you're overthinking it," Jonas said, leaning back in his chair. "She's always been honest with you. Maybe she's just stressed from work." His words should have reassured me, but they didn't. If anything, they made me feel worse. Jonas didn't see the things I saw. He didn't feel the distance growing between us like a canyon slowly widening every day. The breaking point came one evening when Avery told me she was going to meet up with her friend Laurel. Something about the way she said it felt off, too casual, too rehearsed. I waited for her to leave, and then called Laurel myself. "Hey, it's Kian. Just wanted to check if Avery made it to you okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by Laurel's awkward response. Yeah, we met, but that was last week, not tonight." I hung up without saying another word. My chest felt like it had been filled with cement. I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't crazy. Avery was lying to me. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to think, to process what the hell was happening to my life. Instead, I suggested we attend the upcoming corporate party together, hoping it might give me some answers, or at least confirm my worst fears. But Avery's reaction threw me off. "Are you sure you want to go?" she asked, her voice unnaturally light. "It's not mandatory or anything." It was subtle, but the hesitation in her voice told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want me there. And the question that haunted me wasn't just about the party. It was about us. What else had she been hiding? The night of the corporate party finally came, and I just knew, something was about to unravel. Avery had been in the bathroom for nearly 2 hours, longer than I'd ever seen her take to get ready. When she finally stepped out, I barely recognized her. She wore a dress I'd never seen before, a sleek, black number that clung to her in ways that made it impossible not to notice. It wasn't just sexy, it was deliberate. It screamed, "Look at me. New dress." I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She smiled without meeting my eyes, brushing past me to grab her purse. "Got it on sale." That was her go-to line lately, anytime something new popped up. A bracelet here, a pair of heels there. But this wasn't just a sale dress. This was chosen for someone, and it sure as hell wasn't me. I could feel the knot forming in my gut, twisting tighter as we drove to the event in silence. Avery, on the other hand, looked serene, even excited, tapping her nails on the window in time with the radio. When we arrived at the venue, she immediately gravitated toward Richard. I should have expected it, but it still hit me like a punch to the ribs. I watched as she stood a little too close to him, laughing at every one of his jokes. Stupid jokes that even he didn't seem convinced were funny. Richard had this way about him, all charm and arrogance wrapped in an expensive suit. He touched her shoulder casually, but the way his hand lingered made my blood boil. I tried to play it cool, joining conversations with other colleagues, but my eyes kept drifting toward the two of them. No matter where I went, she was always right there next to him, sipping her wine and giving him her undivided attention. I leaned in to talk to her at one point, trying to break their bubble. "You look amazing tonight," I whispered, praying for some kind of connection. Avery gave me a brief smile, but her eyes flicked back to Richard almost immediately. "Thanks," she said, as if she were talking to an acquaintance, not her husband. The tension was unbearable, tightening around me like a noose. I excused myself to the bar, needing a drink to drown the growing ache in my chest. As I stood there nursing my whiskey, I watched them disappear into a side hallway. Avery said something about checking the stage for the performance, but I knew better. This wasn't about work. This was something else. I don't know what possessed me to follow them, but before I could think it through, I was moving, quietly, deliberately, slipping down the hallway after them. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I didn't care. I needed to know. The corridor was dimly lit, and their voices echoed softly ahead of me, leading me to a closed door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear. "You shouldn't," Avery said, but her voice was playful, teasing. Richard's low chuckle followed. "You always say that." Then came the unmistakable sound of lips meeting, soft, wet, deliberate. My fists clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms, drawing blood. I stood there frozen, the betrayal crashing over me like a tidal wave. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and snapped a few photos through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. It wasn't much, just enough to capture their silhouettes and the closeness between them. Enough to confirm everything I'd been dreading. I stood there a moment longer, listening to their muffled laughter, before quietly slipping away. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk. One step, then another, until I was back in the crowded main hall. The noise, the music, the chatter, it all felt distant, like I was moving through a dream. Avery returned to my side a few minutes later, her cheeks flushed and her lipstick slightly smudged. She gave me a quick smile, as if nothing had happened. "Where'd you go?" she asked, reaching for a drink. I shrugged, keeping my voice even. "Just needed some air?" She seemed satisfied with that answer, not realizing that the air between us was already suffocating. The ride home was pure silence. Avery was far too cheerful for someone who'd just spent the night with her husband. She hummed along to the radio, her fingers tapping against the steering wheel. I sat beside her, gripping my phone in my pocket, the photos still fresh on the screen. "So, did you enjoy the party?" she asked, glancing at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I stared out the window, my jaw tight. It was interesting to watch some people. Her smile faltered, just for a second, but she recovered quickly. She knew, I think, somewhere deep down, She knew the game was over. But neither of us said anything more. We just drove through the night in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. When we finally pulled into the driveway, she leaned over and kissed my cheek, a hollow gesture, empty of any real affection. "Good night," she whispered, slipping out of the car and heading inside. I stayed behind for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. There was no going back now. The cracks in the facade had shattered, and all that was left was the truth. Cold, sharp, and unforgiving. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The day after the party, I sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring at the screen of my phone. The photos of Avery and Richard were still there, undeniable proof of her betrayal. I should have been angry, devastated, but mostly I felt empty, like something inside me had snapped and there was no fixing it. That's when an idea came to me. Not something I'd planned, more like a spark that ignited in the wreckage. Scarlett, Avery's little sister. Scarlett was younger, wilder, and everything Avery wasn't anymore. She and I always got along, sometimes too well. I remember the way she'd look at me at family gatherings, her eyes lingering just a second too long, her smile carrying a hint of something forbidden. At the time, I thought it was harmless. But now it felt like an opportunity. I sent her a text. "Hey, you free for coffee sometime? Could use some company." She replied almost instantly. "Sure. Tomorrow?" My treat. The next afternoon, I met her at a small cafe downtown. She arrived wearing a tight red sweater that clung to her curves and jeans that showed off her legs. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun, and the second she saw me, she lit up with that playful, flirtatious smile I hadn't seen in far too long. "Look at you," she said, leaning in for a hug that lasted a beat longer than necessary. "It's been too long, Kian. You look good." "Thanks," I muttered, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. "You too." We grabbed our drinks and settled into a corner booth. The conversation flowed easily. Too easily, if I'm being honest. Scarlett was charming, funny, and most importantly, she was interested in me. She complimented me in ways Avery hadn't in months, reminding me of the man I used to feel like before everything with Avery started falling apart. "Honestly," she said, leaning across the table, "I always thought you deserved better than what Avery gives you." I should have stopped it there. I should have said something, anything, to steer the conversation back into safer waters. But I didn't. Instead, I let her words settle over me like a warm blanket, soothing the ache Avery had left behind. When we finished our coffee, neither of us wanted to say goodbye just yet. Scarlett suggested we grab dinner, and I didn't hesitate. One meal turned into 2 glasses of wine, and before I knew it, we were sitting on my couch, the space between us shrinking by the second. "This is nice," Scarlett whispered, her hand brushing against mine. "Being here with you." I knew exactly where this was going, and for once, I didn't care about the consequences. I leaned in, and she didn't pull away. That night, we didn't talk about Avery or Richard or anything else that might have mattered. It was just Scarlett and me, tangled in the sheets, lost in a moment that felt dangerously close to freedom. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through the blinds, I lay there beside her, staring at the ceiling. I knew what we'd done was wrong, but I also knew I didn't regret it. Not one bit. Scarlett stirred beside me, stretching like a cat before turning to face me. "Morning," she whispered with a lazy smile. "Morning," I muttered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We didn't talk about what it meant, or what would happen next. We didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. In the days that followed, Scarlett and I fell into a dangerous rhythm. We started meeting on weekends, under the guise of just catching up. But there was nothing innocent about the way she looked at me, or the way her hand would linger on mine across the table. The affair became our secret world, a place where Avery didn't exist, where her betrayal didn't matter. Scarlett and I exchanged texts that were anything but friendly, intimate messages filled with promises and innuendos. And every time I saved one of her photos to my phone, I made sure to leave it in plain sight. Part of me wanted Avery to see them. Hell, part of me dared her to. It wasn't long before Scarlett and I started taking photos together, too. Pictures of us curled up on the couch, her head resting on my chest, our hands intertwined. I left those photos on my phone deliberately, knowing that Avery had a habit of snooping. It was only a matter of time before she found them, and I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she did. Each time Scarlett came over, it felt like I was reclaiming something Avery had taken from me. We laughed, drank wine, and made love with a kind of reckless abandon I hadn't felt in years. With Scarlett, I didn't have to pretend everything was fine. I could just be angry, bitter, satisfied, whatever the moment called for. I knew I was playing with fire, but at that point, I didn't care if it all went up in flames. As far as I was concerned, the life I had with Avery was already ashes. And if I was going to burn, I was damn well going to take her down with me. This wasn't just an affair. It was revenge. And it felt good. It was bound to happen sooner or later. I knew it, and deep down I wanted it to happen. The thrill of keeping a secret only lasts so long. Eventually it needs to explode, loud and messy. That's exactly what happened one morning, in a way that was almost too perfect. I had left my phone on the kitchen table, a rare lapse in judgment, or maybe not so rare. Maybe part of me wanted her to find it. Avery was shuffling around the kitchen in one of those half-hearted attempts to play the good wife, pouring herself coffee like everything between us was still normal. I sat at the counter, scrolling through an article on my laptop, pretending not to notice the way her eyes kept flicking toward my phone. And then it buzzed. I didn't even bother looking at it. I knew who it was. Scarlett. And I knew exactly what the message said, because I'd read it a dozen times before. Can't wait for tonight. I saw Avery's hand freeze mid-pour, her whole body stiffening. Her gaze locked onto the phone screen. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she set down her coffee, reached for my phone, and unlocked it with a swipe of her finger, like she had a right to do that. The silence in the room was deafening. Her breathing grew shallow as she scrolled through the thread of messages, each one a little dagger to the life she thought she had control over. There were the photos of Scarlett and me, smiling in my apartment, her head resting on my chest. There were the intimate messages, some playful, some explicit. It was all right there in black and white. She slammed the phone down on the counter so hard I thought it might crack. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "With my sister? Are you fucking kidding me, Kian?" I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I just leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "And how could you," I said, meeting her furious gaze, "betray me with Richard?" For a split second, the anger drained from her face, replaced by something that almost looked like guilt. Then, just as quickly, the rage returned, but this time it wasn't as sharp. It was defensive, desperate. "That was a mistake," she spat. "I got confused." "Confused?" I repeated, barely holding back a bitter laugh. "Then why did it go on for months?" She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She knew I had her cornered, and the satisfaction of watching her squirm was more gratifying than I expected. Every lie she'd told, every excuse, every time she pulled away from me, it was all laid bare now, with nowhere left to hide. The sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor broke the tense silence. Scarlett appeared in the doorway, dressed in one of those tight little outfits that Avery always hated. She crossed her arms, leaning against the frame with a smirk that told me she was enjoying this just as much as I was. "This is your fault," Scarlett said, her voice dripping with venom. "You never appreciated Kian the way he deserved." Avery's face crumpled, the weight of everything hitting her all at once. I watched her crumble, tears welling in her eyes, her whole body shaking with sobs. I should have felt bad, should have, but all I felt was cold satisfaction. "I know I made a mistake," Avery whispered, her voice cracking. "But I don't want to lose you, Kian. Please." She reached out to me, her hands trembling, as if she thought she could still fix what was already broken beyond repair. "It's too late," I said, my voice as cold as the look in my eyes. "You already lost me." Her knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, unmoving, watching the woman I once loved dissolve into a broken mess in front of me. But the part of me that had loved her was long gone, burned away by every lie, every betrayal. And there was no going back. When Avery suggested we still attend her family's annual dinner, I almost laughed in her face. She was desperate, clinging to any scrap of normalcy left, as if sitting around a table with her family could undo everything she'd done. But I agreed, not because I wanted to mend things. No, I saw the dinner for exactly what it was, a stage, perfectly set for the grand finale. A chance to blow everything to pieces, right in front of her family, friends, and the people whose opinion she cared about most. She spent hours getting ready that day, throwing on makeup to hide the swelling around her eyes from the tears she'd cried after our last fight. When she came downstairs, she gave me a cautious smile, like she still thought there was a way to salvage us. "I know things are rough," she said softly, smoothing down her dress. "But thank you for coming. It really means a lot." I just gave her a slight nod, grabbing the car keys. "Yeah," I muttered. "Sure." The drive was uneventful. She talked small talk, forced and brittle, but I didn't engage. I kept my focus on the road, thinking about the perfect moment to drop the bomb. Avery kept glancing over at me like she was waiting for a sign, some hint that I might still care. But that version of me was gone. The only thing left was the man ready to ruin her in the most public way possible. When we arrived at her parents' house, the tension followed us inside like a ghost. Her parents greeted us warmly, oblivious to the fact that their daughter's marriage was already a corpse. Her mom kissed me on the cheek. Her dad clapped me on the shoulder. Scarlett was there too, giving me that little knowing smile, as if she knew exactly what I had planned. The dinner started like any other family gathering. Conversations floated around the table about work, vacations, and mundane little updates that meant nothing to me. Avery sat stiffly beside me, her smile brittle, her hands nervously fidgeting in her lap. Scarlett sat across from us, sipping wine and smirking every time our eyes met. I played along, biding my time. I laughed at her dad's bad jokes, made polite conversation with her mother, and waited, patiently, for the perfect moment to pull the pin and throw the grenade. That moment came midway through the meal. The chatter around the table had settled into a comfortable lull, everyone distracted by their food and drinks. I set down my fork, leaned back in my chair, and glanced around the table. "I've been thinking about something," I said, my tone casual, like I was about to ask someone to pass the bread. "I wonder what's harder to forgive, cheating with your boss or with your sister?" The words hit the room like a wrecking ball. Forks clattered against plates. Glasses paused midair. Every conversation died in an instant. Avery's face drained of color, her eyes wide with panic. "Kian," she whispered a warning, but it was too late. Her parents exchanged confused glances, her father furrowing his brow. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, looking between Avery and me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen a few times. Then I turned it around, holding it up for everyone to see. The photos were right there, clear as day. Avery, pressed up against Richard, their faces inches apart, locked in a kiss. A gasp escaped her mother's lips. "Oh my God!" Her father's face twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. "How could you do this, Avery?" her mother hissed, voice trembling with rage. "And with his boss? Are you out of your mind?" Avery was scrambling, her words tumbling out in a frantic mess. "It wasn't like that. It was just flirting. It meant nothing." I couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through her excuses. "Flirting? That's a hell of a way to flirt, don't you think?" Before Avery could respond, Scarlett chimed in, swirling the wine in her glass like she was watching her favorite soap opera unfold. "And what about my relationship with Kian?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Did that mean nothing?" Avery's head snapped toward her sister, her face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. You bitch," she whispered, her voice cracking. Scarlett just shrugged, taking another sip of her wine. "Don't act so surprised. You didn't want him, so I took him. Simple as that." The room erupted. Avery's mother was screaming, a mix of anger and heartbreak spilling out of her in frantic waves. "You've disgraced this family," she yelled, her voice shrill with emotion. Avery's father slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough," he barked, rising from his chair. He glared at Avery, his face red with fury. You've embarrassed us all. I can't believe you'd do something like this. With his boss, for God's sake. Avery was in full meltdown mode by now, sobbing uncontrollably, trying to explain herself. But it was useless. The damage was done. There was no fixing this. Her father stormed out of the room, muttering something about how she'd disgraced the family, while her mother sank into her chair, head in her hands, sobbing quietly. Scarlett leaned back in her seat, looking entirely too pleased with herself. I stayed where I was, watching it all unfold with a cold sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. The morning after the disaster at her parents' house, I knew there was no turning back. The cracks in our relationship had shattered into a pile of jagged shards, and I wasn't about to stick around, trying to glue them back together. I filed for divorce the very next day. There was no long conversation, no heartfelt pleas, just a cold, calculated decision. Avery tried, of course. She begged, pleaded, cried through tantrums, all of it. She would sit at the edge of our bed, tears streaming down her face, saying things like, "Please, Kian, we can fix this. I know I messed up, but I'll do anything. We can still make it work." But I was done. I didn't respond. I wouldn't even look at her half the time. Her words washed over me like rain on a windshield. Harmless, pointless noise. I made sure my lawyer was the best I could afford. I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was making sure I walked away with as much as possible while leaving her with nothing. She deserved that much after what she did. When the court hearings started, Avery looked like a ghost of herself. Pale, hollow-eyed, and clinging to whatever scraps of dignity she could still find. It didn't help that I had everything on my side. The photos, the texts, the late-night calls, all the evidence of her affair with Richard. The judge didn't need much convincing. He ruled overwhelmingly in my favor, granting me the better share of our assets. Avery fought. Oh, she fought hard, but the evidence spoke louder than her tears. The look on her face when the verdict came down was one I'll never forget. Utter disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend that she was losing everything. As the ink dried on the final divorce papers, Richard Carmichael, the man who'd been worth ruining our marriage over, distanced himself from her like the coward I always knew he was. Rumors floated back to me through mutual acquaintances. Apparently, Richard hinted that if she stayed at the company, it might not reflect well on his leadership. A polite way of saying she was done there, too. Without me, her job, or even her reputation, Avery was a woman adrift. Her friends, most of whom had probably known about her affair but never dared to tell me, began to disappear one by one. Even Laurel, her supposed best friend, gently suggested she keep her distance from the family to avoid more embarrassment. And then there was her mother. The last time I heard, they weren't on speaking terms. Something about bringing shame to the family had been the final nail in the coffin. I didn't care enough to ask for more details. As for me, I wasted no time cutting ties. I moved out of the house we once shared and found a new apartment in the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. A space free from the ghosts of our failed marriage. Scarlett? Well, we kept things going, at least for a while. I won't pretend it was some grand love story. It was easy, and easy was exactly what I needed. I knew better than to think it would last forever, but for now, it was enough. We spent weekends together, went out to bars, and fooled around like we were the only two people in the world. She filled the void Avery had left, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Not one bit. There were times when I wondered if Scarlett felt more for me than I did for her, but I didn't dwell on it. I was too busy enjoying the freedom, the absence of lies and manipulation, the thrill of being able to live my life on my own terms. Jonas threw a party a few weeks after the divorce was finalized. It was one of those low-key gatherings, just close friends, beer, and music. I showed up late, as usual, and found him holding court near the kitchen with a drink in hand. When he saw me, he grinned and pulled me into a bear hug. "Kian, my man, how's the new life treating you?" I clinked my beer bottle against his. "Better than ever." We sat on the balcony that night, the city lights flickering in the distance. People drifted in and out of conversations, but I mostly stayed quiet, letting the hum of voices wash over me. At some point, Jonas leaned over and nudged my shoulder. "You good?" I smiled, a real smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yeah, I said, raising my bottle. I think I am. We toasted to new beginnings, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light, like the weight of everything was finally gone. The past was behind me, and as I sat there, listening to the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, it was going to be on my terms. And that was all I needed,